Greetings, animals. How are you? Hope you're well. This is going to be another Let's Read. I'm going to read more to you guys, and you're going to like it. Hope you're well. Let's see. The book we're going to be reading today, actually over several days, is More Equal Animals, The Subtle Art of True Democracy by Daniel Larimer. Let's see, where should I begin? Who is Dan Larimer? Well, he invented BitShares, one of the first decentralized cryptocurrency exchanges. He then, after that, went on to invent and create, what came after that? Steam? After that, and then after Steam, which turned into Steemit and all sorts of others, he went on to create, you might have heard of it, the EOS cryptocurrency and the company Block One, which is one of the most successful cryptocurrencies around right now. This guy is wicked smart, and more interesting for the topic of this book is that he has been in the middle of trying to make decentralized structures of people functional. Why is that important? Well, the book that we're about to read lays out a method of organizing society, small groups of people all the way up to large groups of people, in a consensual way. Learning a lot of the lessons that he learned from trying to organize massive amounts of anonymous random people into cryptocurrency projects. Why is this book what I'm reading? Is a very valid question for the next one for this channel. It is because there are very few people that have spent time creating works that attempt to invent how free societies could work. That is an extremely difficult, daunting task, at least for me, to approach. Trying to not only sort of predict the future, but in the case of this guy, he's sort of inventing a new technology and in terms of how a society can be organized by taking the lessons that are uniquely learned from the cryptocurrency space. And this is my opinion, this isn't his words, but he's taking these lessons that he's learned from the cryptocurrency space, decentralizing power, specifically attempting to decentralize power. And he's bringing that to an attempt to reform society and the way that we interact and associate. Like, this is, in my opinion, vastly more useful of an endeavor to spend your time on than most common forms of street activism, most, if not all, political activism. You know, like the dude that co-opted, or, you know, the group of people that co-opted the Boog movement, their marches in the streets do nothing for liberty. The left's marches, the right's marches, the open carry marches, most of that does precisely nothing towards liberty. The people like Rothbard, like Dan now, and like the book that we just finished reading, actually, that was another attempt at sort of spelling out and designing a society that could work in freedom. Okay, so there are very few people doing this, and most of the attempts have some holes, and that's fine. That doesn't matter. We can still learn from them. This is a unique take. I have read this book once, and it was about a month ago. And the fact that I'm reading it again, I'm not doing this for you. Remember, most of this reading, this is stuff I'm doing on my own. I'm reading these books for myself. I'm doing it on stream to hopefully benefit other people that might not have time or might want my commentary on some of these books. So I'm going to read this book a second time anyway for multiple reasons. One, again, there's very few works out there like this. Two, the perspective he brings to this topic is truly unique. And I don't say that with any kind of, it's not hyperbolic. These are unique ideas. There are some unique ideas in here that no one in the liberty space has ever brought forward before. And that's exciting in and of itself. And then probably third and finally, I will probably be discussing this book, and I would even go so far as to say challenging him on some parts of the book, live on Anarcast or Disenthrall, I don't know which yet, in the relatively near future. And I'll also say that this project warrants maybe some more attention from myself in terms of trying to work towards refining it, or even maybe putting it into some sort of action. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see how it goes. Anyway, I guess enough blah blah blahing. What's up, Alfredo? So unlike the morning think times, the Let's Read series, I will be watching comments. I'm happy to interact with you if you guys have thoughts that I don't think, or ideas or questions or whatever. I'll definitely be watching chat. I'm watching Odysee chat. I'm watching YouTube and Facebook for this one. So I see you, Adam. I see you, Al. Good to see you guys. Yeah, smart contracts is part of this book, actually, in his conception of property and contract law. So let's get into it. And look, like I can't show you a picture right now, but I don't know. Almost every other page, I have it marked and flagged, and I have something highlighted that I either love or really disagree with, or I have a question about. So I'm probably going to have a lot of notes and thoughts as we go through this. So if that's what you're here for, that's what you're going to get. That's not what you're here for, move along. Wait for the next video. All right, let's get into it. More Equal Animals, The Subtle Art of True Democracy by Daniel Larimer. And I always take time to read the copyright page, because that really tells you where the person's coming from. Copyright 2019, Daniel Larimer. This book makes an argument against intellectual monopoly. Therefore, to practice what it preaches, you may use and reproduce this work without any restriction other than attribution, if and only if you agree to allow others to do the same with any and all of your copyrightable works. For those who still believe in copyright, all rights are reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, or otherwise, without the prior written permission of the copyright holder. I would like to thank the many named and unnamed people who contributed to this book, including there's a foreword by Mike Maloney, commentaries by Joel Salatin, editing contributions, blah, blah, blah. Okay, here we go. Dedication to my loving and supportive wife who stands by me and sacrifices so that I may pursue my life's work, and to our children and grandchildren for generations to come, that they may enjoy an abundance of freedom. So, in general, I like the copyright section of this book much better than the last book that we read. So, yeah, permission based on your values, exactly. Awesome. Okay, foreword by Mike Maloney. There is a difference between who I just hung out with, by the way. Awesome gentleman. There is a difference between the meanings of intelligent, smart, logical, and wise. Intelligence is something people are born with. It's their IQ. It's the ability to accumulate knowledge and understand it. Smart is the ability to use that previously acquired knowledge and apply it to create solutions to the problems you encounter in everyday life. You've probably met super intelligent people that have trouble dealing with the simplest things. The absent-minded professor or bookworm who lacks social skills. Whereas someone with street smarts may have less intelligence but knows how to use every bit of it. Logic is the process of analysis, appraisal, and the development of a valid argument. It involves reason and sound judgment to develop, and then persuasiveness to successfully convince others. Sometimes someone can make an argument so compelling and complete that people don't even have to consider it. They just accept it as an inexorable truth. Wisdom is acquired either through direct experience or the observation of the experiences of others. A smart person can come up with a plan using their intelligence and logic, but a wise person can also foresee the consequences. I have great admiration for intelligent, smart, logical, wise people, and Daniel Larimer is all of the above. You hold in your hand one of the most important books ever written. It isn't often that someone comes up with a brand new idea that can literally change the world, and Dan has done that. When you read this book, one thing will become immediately clear. Dan spent a lot of time thinking about some of the biggest problems that humankind faces, and then he used his immense intelligence, smarts, logic, and wisdom to create solutions that nobody has ever thought of before. Solutions that will work. However, he doesn't address every problem individually. Instead, he focuses on the root cause of the problems, the ways in which we organize our societies, and then proposes new systems. Though a good third of this book deals with politics, it is not political, and it does not pursue any ideological agenda. Instead, he proposes new systems to help us reach consensus on how to organize society, the type of government we want, the type of leaders we want, the laws we pass, and the methods we use to pass them. So, obviously, you guys know me. We just saw a lot of we's, and the type of government we want, none. You know, these are the obvious objections and red flags that are popping up in my mind. But you also have to hold out when you're reading other people's work. You have to be careful about applying your definitions to their words. I can't say they're wrong because I don't know how they're using the word government. I don't know what context they're putting behind it. Maybe they are trying to invent a new consensual government as if that's and to them, that's a valid way of using the word government. So we have to be careful with that. That's all I'm saying. So while it's a red flag and it sticks in my craw and I don't like it and I'm uncomfortable by the language used, I can't pass judgment until I know what they mean specifically by that. Coffee, which will hopefully remain off of my body. Okay. Personally, I feel betrayed and disgusted by the whole political process. Today, it's the campaign contributions by special interests, big corporations and Wall Street that select the candidates. Then, for several months, we stage a circus to both entertain and outrage everyone, where we all get to root for our team while decrying the evils of the opposition. Then, finally, the media ignores us all and they pick a winner. Here, Dan has created a solution that strips power from special interests, big corporations, high finance, and the media, and returns it to the voters, empowering every individual. I truly believe that if these ideas can take hold, they will eventually sweep the world. Read this book and listen to the logic. I read it 3 times. If you think there is something you don't fully understand, then find the smartest person you know, tell him or her about it, ask some questions, and then give them the book. If you ask good questions, I can pretty much guarantee they'll read it as well. Then you can have a lively discussion, because discussing and digesting a new concept always brings greater understanding of the subject. If you want to change the world and help make it a better place, then help Dan change the world. First, take this book to heart, then make a start by taking part. Tell people about it. Send them the link to download their own copy. Find other people who also believe that it is the status quo political system that has let us all down. Then, become part of the first non-political party. A party that places its faith not with any particular politician or ideology, but in a fair and honest system of selecting leaders, laws, and ideologies. A system that returns the power to all of us. A system that returns the power to you. That's the end of the foreword by Mike Maloney. Several things come to mind. One of the things I think about as I'm reading the way these things have been phrased in the foreword is that I feel like a lot of anarchists, because of, the early adopters of anarchism, of libertarian thought, are generally, the majorly, Jesus Christ. This is why I don't write my own books. The majority of anarchists and libertarian types are damaged in some way. That's what led them to look behind the curtain, to look for the just authority of the government. And that damage, and once they're awake, once they see the gun in the room, they want to get away from it. They want to be free of it. And they're not allowed to become free of it. They're not allowed to run away. There's nowhere for them to go. There's no way to achieve freedom or gain their own agency. And so and I'm going to use this we loosely because you know how I hate we's, but I think this is true for a lot of anarchist libertarian types. We spend so much of our time being made uncomfortable by, railing against the involuntary authorities and government structures that exist, that we don't even, and it makes sense, we don't spend any time thinking about how it might work in the free society. And, Rothbard's written on it, Machinery of Freedom, for example. Molyneux's written on it, Everyday Anarchy. The last book that we just read did it. But what I mean by that is more specifically, like, even if somebody designed a society that would work like this, we in our current headspace are so anti any kind of anything that looks anything like a government that we have an innate bad gut reaction to people trying to come up with structures for society, because every structured society that exists and has existed has been wholly involuntary and coercive and evil, and so our hackles rightfully raise. And so I think as we read this, my hackles certainly raised. Like there are parts of this book especially that I'm like, okay, this is. I think at one point a pejorative I used when I was thinking to myself was, this is crypto communism. So just know that I'm sort of there with you, but I'm also wanting to point out to myself again and to everybody listening that most of us, I won't say we all, many of us probably have an innate bias against any kind of organizational structure between people. But we also need to recognize that in a free society, people would still come together and organize to improve everyone's lives. Not all, this is the point, not all organizational structures are bad. And that's hard for us to recognize in the current state of the world where we are. It's just the involuntary organizational structures that are bad, I guess is what I'm saying. And I watched closely, and one of the reasons I'm reading this book again is because I'm going to watch even closer this time. I don't remember him advocating ever for anything involuntary. So, I'm going to give you my thoughts. That's what we do. Okay. If you're not here for my thoughts, you're in the wrong friggin' part of the internet. Okay. Introduction. In this book, we will explore new democratic processes designed to encourage consensus building rather than division into political factions. This sentence started the whole book off on a sour note for me. We will explore new democratic processes. Okay, well, again, we got to be careful not to apply our definitions to his use of the word democratic. In fact, he says new democratic processes. So he could mean, and I think he does mean, voluntary democratic processes. So anyway, this was my hackles started to rise, right? The other thing that got my hackles up was consensus building. So many people in the cryptocurrency space talk about consensus as if it's some spiritual panacea where, and every time they talk about it, not every time, frequently when they talk about consensus building, somebody's individual consent is getting erased. Somebody's losing that vote and is getting controlled, and not in a way that they can opt out of. So again, this was just another yellow flag, let's say, for me. Moving on. So we got a whole sentence into the book, and I'm already yapping. Anyway, moving on. Imagine for a moment a democratic society governed without party politics. Again, the word governed should not be used if we're talking about something voluntary. And if we're not talking about something voluntary, then I might as well stop reading now. But again, this is how I use the words. These are just red flags. Lots of red flags. Imagine for a moment a democratic society governed without party politics. Politicians campaigning, mudslinging, identity politics, ballot stuffing, gerrymandering, incumbent advantage, special interests, or debates with the authenticity of a WWE wrestling match. That's a great way to put it. Imagine for a moment that there was a way to change the system without a violent revolution and without needing the cooperation of the prevailing political parties. All of these things can be addressed with a system that empowers the people, which I highlighted because that's a collectivizing language, to hold their government, which is another highlighted thing for me, because of the connotations of government and their government. Like everybody, like I just talked to, what was his name? Scott Horton on Anarchast, and even he, as a libertarian anarchist type, uses the collectivized language. Our government does things. Well, not only is it not my freaking government, I'm not part of that our, but government is a concept and cannot act in the world. Anyway, so I think this is just me as a more nerdy philosopher type, has a lot of these issues when reading the book. I pick up on these tiny details that are not always like substantive objections to what the author's trying to say. Because look, he's not writing this book for nerdy philosophers. He's probably writing this book for the average Joe. And so he's speaking their language. And so I need to shut up and keep reading. Sorry. Alfredo, you've definitely spread your dislike for collective language to me, and I agree that we need to learn how the other side of any argument is using their words. Yeah. Yep. Cool. Okay. All these things can be addressed with a system that empowers the people to hold their government accountable. Political consensus is the process by which people reach agreement about the nature and structure of government. The intent of this book is to provide practical approaches for improving your life and that of your local community for generations to come. The ills of society are an emergent property of the philosophy of the people. So in this book, I lay the framework for a new approach to and philosophy of a true democracy. And true is italicized, and I think when he's using the word true, and this is from having already read the book, when he says true democracy, in his mind, that is not the same thing as any democracy that we think of. When he says true democracy, he's going to, and I'll not define it for him now, I'll let him define it, but just know that when I say the words true democracy, it's oftentimes italicized, and I think he intends it as a different thing, a different beast. So we need to continue withholding judgment. Once the principles are understood, I will present a strategy to realize many benefits of applying the philosophy to your life today without having to get everyone else in the world on board first. Is government necessary? If so, how should one judge the legitimacy of a government? Where do governments gain their power? How do we even agree upon the purpose and powers of government? Assuming we agree on a purpose, who is the judge of the effectiveness of a government in pursuing that purpose, and how do we fix a government which is failing to perform the job it was created to perform? These are the questions I seek answers to, and I invite you to join me. As I write this book in the summer of 2020, the world is on fire. People are divided like never before, and I fear the civil unrest will only get worse unless everyone can come to their senses and realize our common humanity. If we cannot agree on and respect a societal dispute resolution process, then what alternative outcome can we expect? I can't help but recall a scene from the ABC TV show Lost. Survivors of a plane crash are stranded on an island with mysterious monsters and natives that are attacking them while they wait for rescue. Tensions mount and the survivors start fighting amongst themselves when a character named Jack steps in and makes an impassioned speech calling people to work together, saying, quote, "If we can't live together, then we are going to die alone." This book is my call to stop the fighting and find a way to live together. It is time to realize that we all have a common interest in peace, prosperity, and a future for our families. I'm asking you to take a moment and let go of your ideologies and triggers and approach this book with a humble spirit and open mind. Consider for a moment that everything you think you know just might be wrong or incomplete. I can assure you that your ideological enemies have some legitimate concerns that you would be a fool to ignore. How exactly do you plan to deal with those whom you disagree with if and when your faction or party gains power? How exactly will you respond if they resist? Will you resist if your faction loses power? If we don't open the lines of communication and establish a new way of working together, then the fighting will eventually escalate to slavery and genocide. Hopefully we have enough shared humanity left to agree that slavery and genocide are undesirable outcomes. How exactly do I plan to deal with those whom I disagree with? I mean, disassociate. And when my faction gains power, I do not seek power under any faction or even individually. How will I respond if they resist? That's not me. Will you resist if your faction loses power? Again, that's not me. I think he's talking to normies here. Eric Weinstein wrote a whole book comparing politics to pro wrestling, and it's fantastic. Oh, I didn't know that. Interesting. All right. Over the past 15 years, I have pursued non-violent means of organizing society and have adopted and discarded many different ideologies and philosophies. In the process, I have discovered first principles that have allowed me to integrate the truths buried within capitalism, libertarianism, socialism, Marxism, Christianity, and atheism. As a consequence, I can guarantee that something I write may trigger you or challenge your pre-existing notions. With any luck, this book will bring everyone together. I ask you to consider that our language is under attack, and the very words we use to communicate are being subtly redefined or even multiply defined with contradictory meanings. Yes, yes. There is no longer any agreement on fundamental things such as God, natural rights, or morality. We can't even agree. Sorry, I'm having coffee issues. We can't even agree on how many genders there are. The very words capitalist, socialist, and communist mean vastly different things to different people. Everything has become subjective, and in the process, our ability to communicate and compromise is rapidly declining. Words were always subjective. I think when people try and treat definitions of words and language as objective, you get into all sorts of problems and appeals to etymology, which is just a false authority. But yeah, I mean, I'm just quibbling. The thrust of what he's saying is definitely true. It's like a jamming signal over communications and language. Like if people screw with enough definitions, we just lose our ability to communicate the concepts from one human brain to another, and that does degrade our ability to communicate and compromise. So, all right. It is for this reason that I attempt to make the minimum possible assumptions in the hope that there is still some foundation we can build upon to achieve peace. When two people have a disagreement, they can either fight to the death, live and let live, or agree to a process of dispute resolution. If we can't live and let live, then agreeing to a dispute resolution process is preferable to a bloody conflict in which we kill and are killed. The crisis we face today is a crisis in our existing dispute resolution process, our democratic process. We no longer trust our political processes to reach consensus in an agreeable way. My note that I put in the margin here when I highlighted the sentence, I circled all of the hours just because I'm pedantic, is I distrust consensus as much as democracy. Those two terms, and I think I already kind of talked about that. And I write these notes so that I can state my sort of internal thought process and check my own biases as I go. That's what that note was for. It's like I have a bias towards distrusting consensus as much as I have a bias towards distrusting the word democracy, for almost the same reasons. Our elections have become a choice between bad and worse or dumb and dumber. Half the population doesn't trust that the votes are accurately counted. A poll I posted on Twitter revealed that over 14% of the 533 respondents will publicly admit to be willing to facilitate election rigging, and over 20% would support rigging an election at least some of the time. The major media and social media companies actively censor the sitting president and any politically inconvenient stories. We, the people, have lost control of our government, which has been captured by an elite few pulling the strings behind the scenes. These elite can only remain in control by fostering division and preventing consensus building. We, the people, must work together to reclaim our power from those who subvert democracy. The next page has like 5 things highlighted with all sorts of notes. So bear with me as we parse through this. Whether you are an anarchist, voluntarist, capitalist, socialist, communist, Christian, Marxist, atheist, or racist, I am asking you to put aside your utopian policy agendas and fear of other ideologies just long enough to consider a new way to reach consensus that we can all live with. I ask you to consider that the truth eludes us all, and putting any ideology, whatever it may be, in power to the fullest is likely to backfire in ways we could never imagine. Even more important than our ideologies and philosophies is our consensus building and measuring process. If we cannot reach consensus and maintain it, then any utopia is unstable because a person convinced against their will is of the same opinion still. Legitimate government is supposed to be derived from the consent of the governed. Democracy is supposed to be the process by which that consent is derived. In order to grant consent, one must have the ability to negotiate to reach consensus. In order to negotiate, you must have the ability to say no. Once you have reached consensus, every individual must have the ability to enforce the consensus. And lastly, if you are unable to enforce the consensus, or if you disagree with it, then you must retain the ability to leave. It is not enough to declare a consensus like our media and scientists are fond of doing. People must believe that consensus is a true meeting of the minds and not a covert opinion of a minority being presented as a false consensus of the supermajority. So there is like some really good stuff in there, and there's some problems. Anarchism, voluntarism, capitalism, depending on how he defines each of these terms, none of those are policy agendas. None of those are utopian. They are a ban on coercion. And if this new consensus he's describing is not compatible with non-aggression, then it's not much different from government. Now, I think that his conception is compatible with non-aggression, and we'll get to that. But he lumps in anarchism, voluntarism, capitalism with what he calls utopian policy agendas, which, and then he says, putting any ideology, whatever it may be, in power to the fullest. Well, anarchism, voluntarism, capitalism cannot be put in power if the word power is used to mean, non-consensual coercion. If he's using a different version of power, the word power is used a lot in this book, and it seems to be used in many different ways, and so that's a sticking point for me. But then he says, even more important than our ideologies and philosophies is our consensus building and measuring process. Well, if consensus building is not more important than consent. In fact, you can't really have one without the other. So I would say that that's backwards. And then following that, he says, in order to negotiate, you must have the ability to say no. And my note at the time was only if it's individual. But then he sort of he made me feel, I think he gets it with the following part where he says, you must retain the ability to leave. As an individual, you must retain the ability to leave. And that is the problem with democracy. That is what makes all forms of democracy that's ever existed invalid, immoral, because it lacks the consent and the ability to leave without being attacked, so to speak. So let's continue. Society breaks down when any aspect of consent breaks down or is corrupted. This is what is happening today. I guess I had one more thing I wanted to say. Like, he's asking these people, Christians, Marxists, atheists, racists, communists, socialists, and anarchists, volunteers, capitalists. He's basically asking us to put our ideology aside and just give a fair hearing to his ideas. My conceptions of those three terms he used, anarchist, volunteers, capitalist, is so simplistic to mean lack of coercion, no rulers. I shouldn't need to put those away to evaluate his ideas, because if his ideas involve coercion and force and breach of consent, then we're wasting our time and they're invalid. And hopefully I've made that point. Moving on. Society breaks down when any aspect of consent breaks down or is corrupted. Yes! This is what's happening today, and today's outcome is predictably derived from fundamental mathematical, algorithmic, game-theoretic flaws in our implementation of democratic principles. It is not enough to drain the swamp and vote them out. The rules of the game ensure that the government will evolve toward corruption and away from democratic principles. My background. I am a computer programmer, economist, game theorist, and entrepreneur. For the past 15 years, I have made it my life mission to create free market, voluntary solutions for securing life, liberty, property, and justice for all. My hypothesis is that nonviolent solutions to secure our rights against public and private criminals would be incredibly valuable, and therefore those who provide it can help people while also making a lot of money. In 2009, I was attempting to invent my own digital currency when I discovered Bitcoin and blockchain technology. I thought, fantastic, the problem has already been solved. And then immediately got involved with the Bitcoin community and started working on educational material while learning how to write my own blockchain software. It was during this time that I engaged directly with Satoshi Nakamoto, the mysterious creator of Bitcoin. I raised concerns about the scalability of Bitcoin, and Satoshi responded with a now infamous quote, "If you don't believe me or don't get it, I don't have time to try to convince you, sorry." As time passed, my concerns about Bitcoin scalability proved to be correct. I went on to create 3 of the highest performance blockchain platforms in the space: BitShares at bitshares.org, Steem at steemit.com/hive.blog, and EOS.io, EOS.io. All 3 systems reached valuations of several billion dollars at their peak and were among the top 5 blockchain projects of their time. While everyone was attempting to get a handle on what Bitcoin was, I was the first person in the blockchain space to describe blockchains as decentralized autonomous companies, communities, corporations, or organizations. Since then, the concept of DACs, or DAOs, has been widely adopted in the industry. It was this perspective that led me to invent one of the most widely used consensus algorithms known as Delegated Proof of Stake, DPoS. DPoS enabled low-cost, high-performance blockchains with built-in decentralized governance. These governance. I wish he had used the word governance instead of government through most of this book, because there's a difference. Like, government is the non-consensual authority by fiat of a given geographical area. Governance, is a looser term that could just mean, running things. Potentially consensually, right? Where were we? These blockchain characteristics were necessary to build the first decentralized exchange, BitShares, and the world's first decentralized social media platform, Steem. My last blockchain architecture was EOS.io, a platform designed to empower others to build blockchain-based applications and implement smart contracts. Each one of these projects was a social experiment in community building, governance, economic incentives, and game theory. I learned a lot about human nature, coordination problems, community governance, and voting systems. During this time, I was also granted patents for provably honest voting systems and decentralized identity validation. Unfortunately, I also learned that our government effectively outlaws provably honest voting through mandated rules that make election tampering impossible to catch. Rather than taking steps to improve the integrity of the election process, the powers that be are systematically removing protections in the name of democracy. It's almost as if they want people to distrust the election process. I file that under things that make you go, I built my career on challenging the dogmas in the cryptocurrency space and identifying the underlying fundamental principles at play. It was the understanding of these principles that allowed me to create the first self-funding, self-governing, decentralized global communities. I also applied my mental habit of challenging dogmas to all areas of life. As a result, I evolved from a Christian Republican to an anarcho-capitalist atheist, to a voluntarist spiritualist, and finally stumbled upon a position that integrates aspects of socialism, support for government, and, with insights from Jordan Peterson, a new appreciation for the value of Christianity. You could say that I've traveled the world of philosophies and can relate to everyone as being somewhere on my journey. It is through this experience that I discovered and distilled the first principles that unified these apparently contradictory philosophies and led to ideas presented in this book. I don't think he uses first principles the way philosophers use first principles. He might mean like lowest common denominator principles. But yeah, he said he was an anarcho-capitalist and then grew support for government. Like that, something's off. That's a red flag for me. Like once you understand non-aggression and the basic behind the things I've already talked about in this live stream, to support government would be to, you would either have to acknowledge that you would have to change your position to say that there are allowable times for aggression against innocent, peaceful people. So again, maybe he means governance instead of government, but again, he wrote government. He said he went from being an anarcho-capitalist to supporting government. That's a red flag. There's something not right there. Red flag, so to speak. An actually red flag. Communistically red. The tyranny of the status quo is the next chapter. We live in a time of extreme political division, and every day the apparent polarization grows. For over 50 years, the approval rating of the United States Congress has averaged less than 30%, meaning a supermajority does not approve of how things are. Aside from a brief moment after the September 11th attacks, approval has never been above 50%. I suspect that retrospectively, after the emotional distress wore off, the actions taken by Congress during that time are largely disapproved of. It seems to me that a legitimate government would trend toward a 70% approval rating or more. That's a legitimate government is a contradiction in terms depending on your definition of government. If it is non-consensual, then it cannot be legitimate. If it is consensual, then it is not government. At least not any kind of government that has ever existed. But again, he's probably talking to normies and not pedantic people like me. The question becomes, why has it been so bad for so long, and what can we do about it? How did we get where we are? If we are going to consider something new, we must first understand the problems with the status quo so that we do not repeat the same mistakes. Presumed purpose of government. The preamble of the United States Constitution declares the supposed purpose of the United States government, quote, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. How'd that work out? Many people will argue that this Constitution represents what we have all agreed to and therefore should define the purpose and limits of government. This appeal to the status quo is an attractive fallacy because it relieves one of the responsibility of justifying the Constitution. For those who favor the theoretical limits the Constitution places on government, the idea of redefining the basis of our government is terrifying, because there is a legitimate fear that a constitution drafted by modern politicians would decimate the rights they believe the existing Constitution protects. Yeah, well said. On this point, I agree. Modern politicians cannot be trusted to have the philosophical integrity to draft a new constitution. The mere fact that many people fear a new constitutional convention is evidence that they believe their values are not held by the masses, or that the politicians they elect are irredeemably corrupt. If politicians are irredeemably corrupt, then the governance structure defined by the Constitution is the structure that enabled corrupt people to gain the reins of government. Shout out to Lysander Spooner. If instead I said that, sorry. I made the shout out comment. I got to be careful bouncing back and forth between my talk and the book. If instead the politicians actually represent the people, then the Constitution is a minority opinion imposing itself on a majority. Either way, those who resist building a new consensus aim to impose a tyranny of the status quo. Lysander Spooner, oh good, he's quoting him. Lysander Spooner observed, "But whether the Constitution really be one thing or another, this much is certain, that it has either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist." I'm so glad he put that in there. Given a long-term average 30% approval rating, the conclusion is obvious. Our Constitution and the system of government it has established have failed. Entire books have been written documenting the failure of the United States Constitution in achieving its stated purpose. If we were to wipe the slate clean, erase all laws, and unwind all existing government organizations, and start afresh with just the Constitution, how would things go? Would we not end up right where we are now, and in record time? Given this situation is clear, the Constitution must go, and with it our entire structure of government. The government no longer represents and serves the people, if it ever really did. But why did it fail? What should we replace it with? How will we agree? The political party folly. The failure of our system was predicted in the farewell address of the very first president of the United States, George Washington. Quote, "In contemplating the causes which may disturb our union, it occurs as a matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discriminations, northern and southern, Atlantic and western, whence designing men may endeavor to incite a belief that there is a real difference of local interests and views. One of the expedients of party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. You cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heart-burnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection. However, political parties may now and then answer to popular ends. They are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion." End quote, by George Washington. I think it is clear from observing modern politics that Washington was right. The country has been divided in a winner-take-all system. We don't have a body of independent congressmen making personal judgments. We have a system whereby most congressmen are beholden to a political party and unwilling or unable to exercise independent discernment. The 2020 presidential race has devolved into Orange Man Bad versus Orange Man Good. It has become a race between dumb and dumber and between bad and worse. It could hardly be claimed that the choices presented to the people represent the most studied, thoughtful, honest, rational, impartial, and well-spoken people in the country. Given these false choices, something is obviously fundamentally broken. A political party represents a parallel private government comprised of individuals colluding to gain control of the constitutional government. Such collusion undermines the separation of powers intended by the framers of the Constitution. One of the lessons easily observed within the cryptocurrency space is that people are tribal to the core, and these tribes can form around anything you can place a label on. At a certain point, everything devolves into us and them. Anyone attempting to bridge the divide is suspected of disloyalty to both tribes, parties. Politicians naturally end up more loyal to the tribe that put them in power than to the country. This is true whether they are conscious of it or not. A single tribe places people across all branches of government and the semi-autonomous bureaucracies. The effect is that the political tribes undermine the intended checks and balances put into place by the founders to protect the liberties of the people. This is another thing we learn from governance in cryptocurrency communities. There is no such thing as a closed system. People will coordinate outside of the blockchain governance process to take control of the blockchain governance structures. They will create fake accounts, vote with other people's tokens, and collude to redistribute money from the community purse. Regardless the spirit of the laws a community creates, people will attempt to exploit holes in the algorithmic letter of the law, computer code, for private gain. Game theory is a branch of mathematics that analyzes strategies for dealing with competitive situations such as governance. Mechanism design leverages game theory to design systems that produce the desired emergent outcome. This book is derived in part from my experience applying and testing mechanism design in global blockchain communities. A good design must not assume a closed system free from outside cooperation. You cannot outlaw political parties. You must design a system that makes them impossible to form in the first place. Or eliminate the power that feeds them. You can't have this is me talking, you can't have a political party without government power. Let's take a moment and consider some of the irrational consequences of the party system. In the early years of the United States, the vice president was the runner-up in an election. Could you imagine a Trump-Hillary ticket? Since the party system polarizes the population, the implied archetypical outcome would be either Lucifer Christ or Lucifer... Sorry, I'm going to start over. In the early years of the United States, the vice president was the runner-up in an election. Could you imagine a Trump-Hillary ticket? Since the party system polarizes the population, the implied archetypal outcome would be either Lucifer Christ or Christ Lucifer, and every couple of years it would switch. Because this was intolerable, we now have a system where the president-vice president run as a team. But why should we limit the team to the presidential and vice president? To the president and vice president? Why not replace the whole government with the loyal lapdogs of the winning party? Do the people really intend to put a president in charge of a disloyal bureaucracy? The common belief is that this creates, quote, checks and balances and forces the two parties to compromise. One has to wonder, how can Lucifer and Christ compromise? How can good compromise with evil? If they do compromise, it is for the benefit of the people. If they do compromise, is it for the benefit of the people or just the divine spiritual beings, aka the ruling class? If the people elect Christ, should Lucifer's lackeys do their best to undermine him? Should Lucifer be put in charge of heaven or Christ in charge of hell? With the party system, the power of any independent politician is nullified. In extreme cases, a large number of those in unelected governmental positions can work against a widely popular president. If you are not aligned with one of the two primary parties, you will lack the political support necessary to effect change. Given a two-party system, all deliberation and negotiation occurs between the leadership of the parties and not in the larger body of representatives. The true leadership is often behind the scenes and unelected. The parties easily agree on things that reinforce the two-party system. Therefore, over time, outside parties have an increasingly difficult time even getting on the ballot or in the debates. We end up with a one-party system where the debates between the left and right wings, quote left and quote right wings, are limited to topics that don't impact the power structure. In recent years, people have learned that to have a chance in the elections, they must wear a red or blue jersey and then work the private governance system defined by each party. Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders both had tremendous initial success by using their party's internal processes in an attempt to gain the party nomination. In both cases, the powers behind the red and blue parties changed the rules and otherwise cheated them out of the opportunity to be the party's nominee. While these are the most visible examples of how each party controls its internal governance, there are countless smaller examples of both parties turning against outsiders. Stated another way, our country didn't consciously choose to be governed by the party primary processes any more than Bitcoin chose to centralize control in mining pools. Countries are concepts. They don't consciously choose anything. But, I mean, I think we can take his meaning. The centralization of Bitcoin into mining pools, the centralization of Bitcoin mining into pools is a logical inevitability given the game theory involved in Bitcoin's incentive structures. So Satoshi didn't intend for this outcome any more than the framers of the Constitution intended it to devolve into political parties. The major parties evolved and then passed rules to keep themselves protected. A cynical person might come to the conclusion that the primary processes were created to give the illusion that the people are in charge of the parties. Because the parties are considered private organizations, there is very little accountability regarding internal party politics and elections. Most alternative parties don't even hold primaries and implement their own process for selecting nominees. Whether you are cynical or not regarding the legitimacy of the primary nominee selection processes, both major parties implement selection processes which this book will demonstrate are structurally unable to truly represent the will of the party members, let alone the citizens of the United States. The rules that do exist in some states focus on ensuring that you can only vote in a single primary. Voters must choose to be on red team or blue team. If the red and blue teams were really interested in the country and voters were really interested in the country, then voters should be able to vote in both primaries. By picking a tribe, the voter is no longer able to fully represent the country's interest. Instead, he is at least partially aligning with one tribe against the other. I'm unsure specifically where the pedantic line is and whether or not I'm crossing it, but I'm pretty sure this is a valid problem with the sentence. By picking a tribe, the voter is no longer able to fully represent the country's interest. The country has no interest. Even putting aside the country as a concept and a concept not being able to have an interest, what this probably means is the collective of all the humans within the country interest. But that is near completely indeterminate, undiscernible. You can barely get 5 people to decide where they want to have dinner together in the evening. The idea that you're going to have 300 million people and you're going to be able to divine their common interest, near impossible. Much less, like, I mean, somebody's consent is getting erased to come anywhere near determining 300 million people's interest. Okay, moving on. An episode of The Simpsons captured the absurdity of our situation. Homer discovers that both presidential candidates are really space aliens. In an effort to save the nation, he crashes a UFO into the Capitol building and then unmasks the aliens on live TV. Everyone in the audience gasps. Then the aliens taunt the people, quote, "Yes, it's true, we are aliens, but what are you going to do about it? It's a two-party system. You have to vote for one of us." After a maniacal alien laugh, someone from the audience speaks up and says, "I'm going to vote for a third party." The other alien responds, "Go ahead, throw your vote away." The election proceeds and the people are enslaved to an alien tyranny. In the end, Homer says to his wife, Marge, "Don't blame me, I voted for the other alien." The single biggest thing that any system of government must retain is the ability of the people to effect change. John F. Kennedy once said, quote, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable," end quote. Unfortunately, our two-party system, combined with a number of other factors, has created a system that makes change almost impossible. Here are some of the factors that make this so. Number 1. Gerrymandering organizes districts so that one party wins every district, removing any influence minority parties might have. Number 2. Media controls the discussion of who is eligible for the masses to consider and what information the masses have available. Number 3. Incumbent advantage. Number 4. Campaign finance that favors celebrities and big spenders. Number 5. Controlled debates. Number 6. Focus on politicians and not policy, ad hominem fallacies. Number 7. Vote counting corruption. We would have to be insane to keep doing the same things and expecting a different result. It's time to implement a new process that considers everyone in the country, without bias to the status quo powers that be and without corruption of party insiders. The process that considers everyone in the country is called anarchy. This is me talking, sorry. And it's a hackle-raising thing to say that we need to implement a new process. It's like we don't need yet another system. These centrally thought up, designed systems already didn't work for thousands of years and sit on large piles of bodies. But again, this is my red flags speaking. He might be meaning something different, and we need to stay open-minded. True democracy. Do you feel like your vote really matters? Do you approve of how things are working? Oh, so this chapter, I think, is going to define what he means when he says true democracy as a different thing than democracy. Do you approve of how things are working? Do you trust politicians? When was the last time you wrote your representative? When was the last time they wrote back with something non-generic? Should majority rule? Should California have more influence than Iowa? Should cities have more influence than the countryside? Should China and India rule the world? Democracy is generally understood as a government of, by, and for the people. However, there are many forms of democracy, including direct democracy, deliberative democracy, representative democracy, democratic republics, etc. Within all these forms of democracy, there are countless ways of, quote, counting the votes, each of which attempts to determine a fair outcome that, quote, represents the people. It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except for everything else. That said, are all democratic governments equal, or are some forms of democratic government more equal than others? Are some better at representing the, quote, will of the people and protecting the right of the people to change their government? Democracy can be viewed as an attempt to govern society according to a consensus of the majority. Today, the only thing we can seem to reach a consensus on is that our system is broken. We are presented with false choices prepared by a two-party system and a centralized media cartel. Just because a government hosts an election doesn't mean it is governing according to the principles of democracy. After all, even dictators host elections, and few dare to run or vote against them. What good is an election if the rules are unable to prevent cheating? I have come to understand modern democracies as dinos, democracies in name only. A dino is an apt description for dinosaur governance systems that devour their populations like an uncontrollable monster. Dinos don't reveal public opinion. Instead, they give the people a false sense of consensus, while they are manipulated by a hidden and not-so-hidden ultra-minority of tyrants. Jason Brennan, in his book, Against Democracy, outlines all of the ways dinos fail. I would love to incorporate much of his work to demonstrate the problems with democracy as commonly implemented, but that would detract from the focus of this book, so I will summarize a few key points. Brennan addresses the shocking level of political ignorance of the typical citizen over the most basic of things. He states, quote, "When it comes to politics, some people know a lot, most people know nothing, and many people know less than nothing." End quote. Political scientist Larry Bartels noted that, quote, "The political ignorance of the American voter is one of the best documented features of contemporary politics." End quote. Brennan notes that on a test of political knowledge, 25% of the voters were well informed, 25% badly informed, 25% are know-nothings, and 25% are systematically misinformed. He makes the point very clear in this example. Quote, "Imagine you are on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. The host asks you the million-dollar question. Quote, who was more supportive of abortion rights in 2000, Al Gore or George Bush? Suppose you don't know, but the host gives you the option of either flipping a coin or phoning a random U.S. voter from the year 2000. You should flip a coin. It's more reliable." End quote. How is democracy supposed to represent the best interests of the people when the people are not just rationally ignorant, but the quality of their knowledge is statistically worse than random guessing? Brennan is against democracy because as it is commonly implemented, it doesn't produce good governance outcomes. His book documents all of the cognitive biases that impact even the most rational individuals. He also identifies the mechanisms behind tribalism and how the formation of political parties occurs. He demonstrates how encouraging political discussion doesn't lead to compromise, but polarizes us. Brennan is ultimately arguing that not everyone should have the right to vote, and that we should take measures to ensure only the knowledgeable vote. His definition of knowledgeable is still quite broad, such that most people could easily achieve it. While I can agree with his assessment of the problems, I don't feel he offers any viable solutions. The problem isn't the lack of knowledge. It is the expectation that people should even need political knowledge in the first place. Perhaps we should ask people about stuff they know about instead of expecting everyone to know everything so as to make an informed vote. Everyone has some unique knowledge that is valuable, and no one has all the knowledge that is necessary. True democracy implements a process that harnesses the wisdom of the crowd and systematically protects against the need for global knowledge to make sound, independent decisions. That's the market. That's the laissez-faire free market. Prices, for example. No formal system is needed for the market to give you the price signal, to give you the value of something. That was me talking, sorry. The market stuff I was just talking about. That was me. I need to be more clear about that when I shift to me talking. In order to judge the quality of a government, we must first establish a set of values. Normally, it is differences in fundamental values which lead reasonable people to violently disagree about the purpose and power of government. Many people want to limit the power of government based upon a constitution. Other people want the government to have maximum totalitarian power in order to implement their utopian society. Only once we can agree on the limits, if any, on the power of government can we begin discussing how that power could be used and who should wield it. I make few arguments about how the power of government should be used. Instead, I focus almost entirely on the process of delegating that power to individuals. At the end of the day, all decisions, executive orders, laws, judgments, etc., are made by individuals, and the selection of these individuals determines the destiny of a society. A totalitarian dictator for life with libertarian principles can create a completely different society than a totalitarian dictator for life with Marxist ideology. This is another contradiction, and this is me talking. This is another contradiction in terms. There is no such thing as a libertarian totalitarian dictator for life. That is a contradiction. Cannot exist. That is like saying it's an unmarried spouse. Likewise, a democracy can elect people to power and get a wide range of outcomes depending upon the morality of the population and the integrity and form the democratic process implemented. Debates over how government power should be used will always divide us, and these debates are what keep the prevailing parties in power. We must step back from the political issues and establish a new process for reaching consensus and establishing consent. Consent is key to maintaining long-term legitimacy in the eyes of the population. Then we can use that process to make decisions on political issues without resorting to riots. Whether you use an election or not, all people ultimately organize themselves into leaders and followers, and power is effectively delegated. So, I think there's so many different definitions for the word power. We might want to give him the benefit of the doubt in what he's describing here. All people ultimately organize themselves into leaders and followers. That's true. I mean, listen to any of Jordan Peterson's talks on how that's sort of like an inherent characteristic of humans. Even social hierarchies develop naturally. It just happens. So I don't think that part's an issue. And when he says, and power is effectively delegated, so he says all people ultimately organize themselves into leaders and followers, and power is effectively delegated. I wish he'd clarify his use of the word power, because the consensual and non-consensual forms of power might have different outcomes in that sentence. Anyway, moving on. If it isn't an election, then it can be based upon fear, respect, popularity, or family dynasty. There is no escaping the need to delegate power, so we should find the best possible or least bad approach. There is no escaping the need to delegate power. Okay. So if we're talking about consensual power, which would be more like the power you'd grant your doctor to advise you on how to best treat your injury, then I agree. You can't live a very good life without delegating some of that sort of consensual power. Agreed. But if there's any non-consensual power, again, there's no definition of how he's using power, so we don't know. I'm going to assume he means the power in a more generic, amorphous sense, not authority. Maybe that's a distinction. I don't know. I would love clarification on that part. Okay, so the next section is all power comes from consent. All power comes from consent. So that tells me that he's probably using like a consensual power definition, even though I'm not sure I don't like this usage of the word power. When I think about having power, I don't think in terms of consensual agreements and arrangements and relationships. When I think of power, I think of non-consensual ruling power. But again, this could just be my bias, so we gotta keep reading from a neutral perspective. All governmental power comes from the consent of the population, even a population suffering under the worst imaginable dictator. What? Governmental power comes uniquely, wholly from the barrel of a gun. Is he redefining government in this book? Is he just using a totally different definition of government? He says all governmental power comes from the consent of the population. Even a population suffering under the worst imaginable dictator. The worst imaginable the consent of the population is definitionally ignored under the worst imaginable dictator. That sentence makes no sense to me. Even granting him the benefit of the doubt, the benefit of the doubt over the word power, that sentence is an anomaly. I don't get it at all. Moving on. The challenge of getting out from under a corrupt dictator or party system is coordinating enough people to reach a new consensus on who should be in power. We can, therefore, restate the problem of governance as a consensus-building problem, and that a successful society implements a governmental process that protects the people's ability to reach a new consensus. As governments become increasingly tyrannically corrupt, operating against the interest of society, thing that doesn't exist, they institute... That was me talking. I don't know how to insert my thoughts without confusing people. Talking like a different voice. As governments become increasingly tyrannically corrupt, operating against the interests of society, a thing that doesn't exist, they institute measures designed to hinder the population from reaching a new consensus. They do this to protect the power they achieved with the existing consensus system. It is like cutting the rungs off the ladder to power as you climb. This often takes the form of propaganda and censorship, but can also occur via prison and death for those attempting to peacefully organize a new consensus. Pay attention to any content that is censored. It almost always indicates a threat to those in power and knowledge you likely need to know. Truth does not require censorship. However, lies depend upon censorship of truth. Well said. That was well said. That was well said. Often, it is easy for the vast majority to agree that an existing government is corrupt and that the institutions of society are no longer serving the public's interest. Gallup polls show 70% agreement on this point. However, it is far more difficult to get people to agree on a solution. The corrupt powers that be will intentionally divide the population with propaganda and political favors to hinder their ability to work together. After all, how can a net taxpayer, what I would call a tax victim, compromise with a net benefit receiver? I did it again. I'm sorry. I said the tax victim thing. You're just going to have to bear with me. After all, how can a net taxpayer compromise with a net benefit receiver? How can someone who has become dependent upon a government program bite the hand who feeds him? Once a political system becomes corrupt, it is impossible to use the system to fix it. In theory, the population would just remove the bad actors and replace them with good actors. But in practice, this doesn't happen. This is because the problem is systematic corruption, not individual corruption, and because there is no consensus on the meaning of good and bad. In the Declaration of Independence, the founders of the United States demonstrate the rationale and justification for dissolving an existing political system and establishing a new one. While modern society may take issue with the self-evident claims regarding a creator, nature's God, and unalienable rights, the premise of the Declaration remains, quote, that when any that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to the people's intent, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. The Declaration of Independence. I'm going to shout out my Declaration of Individual Independence here. If you guys haven't read, if anybody's listening to this and you haven't read or listened to the Declaration of Individual Independence, I would highly suggest it. You can find it in video form on this channel, Disenthrall. Just search for the Declaration of Individual Independence. If you want to read the actual document that's been translated now into French and Portuguese, you can find it at the link to it at the top of notgovernor.com. Okay. The Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and, accordingly, all experience hath shewn that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. God. Epic document. Definitely read the individual version. It's even better. Declaring independence is vastly different from asking for privileges and concessions from the powers that be. Today, many people are fighting a war for dependence, also known as the right to force others to provide them with goods and services they are unable or unwilling to earn themselves. Independence is about taking responsibility for your life and your local community. The opposite of independence is dependence. Independence is necessary for freedom. Without freedom, you are effectively enslaved. We need to be careful with the word enslaved, but probably more on that later. If you are not responsible for your life, then you become dependent upon somebody who becomes responsible for you. Also need to be careful with the word responsible. If responsible means you have a positive obligation to take action, then I disagree here. Dependence is not enslavement. Like, you can be an idiot and grow dependent on somebody else. That does not make you that person's slave. Slavery requires coercion and at least a threat of violence from the owner, the slave master, whatever. Anyway, we just have to be careful with these words. They have very important meanings that we want to make sure that we don't mess with without good reason, or at least without saying it up front, to be clear. Anyway, moving on. It is interesting that our society talks frequently about fighting for, quote, freedom and, quote, democracy, but almost never talks about fighting for independence. Independence is the foundation of freedom and democracy. Freedom and, quote, democracy don't necessarily give you independence. Independence requires self-reliance and responsibility. To understand the critical difference between freedom and independence, consider that some people claim that responsibility interferes with their freedom. For example, having to go to work interferes with your freedom to watch TV. By making claims like this, people aim to achieve their freedom at the expense of someone else's slavery to their foregone responsibilities. In order to pay for your TV, someone else had to carry the responsibility of going to work. Now, when we're talking about taxation, slavery is an apt term to be using. Ironically, independence is a precondition to consent, and consent is a precondition to legitimate democratic government. What? I mean, so the fable goes, but it has never worked that way ever anyway, so this would be a technical definition, not a practical one, or a historical one. You cannot fight for freedom and democracy without fighting for your right of independence. Without individual independence, you don't have a democracy. What? I mean, a consensual democracy? With independence, this is me talking, with independence, you don't have a democracy. It seems like we're redefining core terms we're using here. Democracy, government, power, slavery. Democracy has never in the history of the world been consensual or individual. It's always collectivizing people, and the minority always has their consent erased. Moving on. It is perhaps easy to visualize this as the difference between a teenager wanting freedom to live his life however he likes, while still living under his parents' roof, eating their food and driving their car. Seeking freedom while remaining dependent is to seek your freedom at the expense of someone else. What said teenager should be seeking is the right to move out and take care of himself. In many cases, the teenager counts the costs and realizes that he is not yet ready for fully independent living. He has much to learn about taking care of himself and must make sacrifices of his time and energy to produce what he currently gets from his parents for free. The truth is that nothing is free. Eventually his parents will die and he will be forced to become responsible for his own life, or he too will die. What teenagers really want is independence. They want the ability to make their own choices. If they cannot carry the full responsibility of independent living, then they can find the next best thing. Life with a roommate or several. In this case, the teenager trades the tyrannical rules of his parent, the government he was born under, for the hopefully more acceptable consensus rules of his roommates. A peace treaty chosen by him and his roommates. He still has chores, limits on noise, and limits on having friends over, but is hopefully enjoying more liberty because he consented than he had under his parents' roof, where there was no negotiation. To get this liberty, he must still earn enough to cover his portion of rent and utilities, or his roommates would kick him out. Fighting for independence is fighting for the right to take care of yourself, to live and let live. Fighting to prevent independence is like a parent locking their teenager in the house where they are compelled to do chores and work the family business. It would be like your roommates refusing to let you move out because they want your help paying their rent. It is like England refusing to let the colonies leave in peace. It is like northern states refusing to let southern states govern themselves. It is like slave owners refusing to let people work for others. Many people perceive a declaration of independence as a declaration of war, but this need not be the case. Independence begins as a mental state of being, which when acted out results in reducing your dependence on the status quo, while organizing and respecting a parallel system of consensus. The more dependent we are upon our parents, the harder it is to move out and enjoy the freedom derived from the responsibility of independence. If we are to achieve freedom from the powers that be, we must first remove our dependence upon them and take responsibility for our lives, our community, and our society. The community is big enough, is about the maximum. The community concept is about as big as you could consider bearing some kind of responsibility for. Society in general, everyone, this is too large and amorphous for me to even feel much affinity to, much less a responsibility. The first act of independence is to reach out to your neighbor and invite them to join you in creating a new social contract. Okay, let me try reading that again. The first act of independence is to reach out to your neighbor and invite them to join you in creating a new social contract and a new process for reaching consensus. There has never been, this is me talking, there has never been an original social contract. The word social, I know what he means, and it is not the words that he used. He means an actual contract, not a social contract. Forget social. Like, he's talking about an actual contract. Really, really shouldn't have written it that way, in my opinion. Sorry. Almost choked to death there. Fat Cat, yes. No Treason is available on this channel. You can search for it. Would recommend. I released it for free. Feel free to donate as well if you get value out of it. And that was done as an actual audiobook, not with my commentary like this one we're doing. This book will give you and your neighbors a path forward to building a new consensus in your community based upon principles for a new form of democratic government that aims to be better than previously implemented systems and presents a roadmap to implementing it in the world. That said, no system of government is perfect, and even the best form of government is at the mercy of the prevailing virtues of the people being governed. The means justify the end. Given the multitude of democratic processes, how can we determine the best one to implement as we rebuild our independent society? How are we to judge them? Perhaps one of the biggest problems people face is judging a system according to their individual prediction of its outcome. Stated another way, people can judge the means as good or bad, depending upon the predicted end. If you are in the minority, then the idea of unrestricted democratic power, whether direct or indirect, could be a threat. This means that those with minority opinions argue for rights and limits on government power. Eventually, people will complain when the people running the government ignore the constitutional limits. Then they are at a loss when they realize they have no recourse. The battle over the legitimacy of popular vote versus electoral college often depends on which side of the political party divide one happens to be on. People will switch sides on this from election to election, which means their opinion is not based upon principles. Cool, we'll check it out. Dope. Thanks. Yeah, man. Enjoy. It is one of the most important things I've done with my life. That is an important book. I don't agree with everything in it, especially the stuff about voting, but you can find out more information on my objections to that on disenthrall.me/voting, I think is the URL for that. All right. This end justifies the means philosophy is the seed of genocide and totalitarian utopianism. Yes. The means must justify themselves and be consistent with truth and integrity of the community consensus. The means must produce self-correcting results. Dislike of the outcome is not in itself an argument against the means. From a certain perspective, there is no end, there is only the means. So the means better justify themselves. To have an end assumes that no additional laws or changes are needed. An end implies denying others the path to power. It implies an end to democracy. Society is an emergent property of individuals, and the two must live in a symbiotic relationship because individuals depend on society and society is comprised of individuals. The challenge of government is that it is supposed to be operated by individuals for the benefit of society, but individuals are easily corrupted by the ability to use the power society grants them for personal gain. This is a lot of reifying the word society. Society doesn't exist, so it can't be in a symbiotic relationship with actual individuals that actually exist. Better way of saying this would have been to say that individuals are symbiotic creatures. You know, it's very difficult to live as a lone solo entity. We all have symbiotic relationships with each other. I'm probably just being pedantic around the word society. And again, like, government cannot act, first of all, but even if it could not act for the benefit of society, because the benefit of society is an unknowable, undefinable thing, because society is a group of 300 million plus or more individuals, depending on what level of society you're talking about. So anyway, I find that entire paragraph like a failure to compile line of code. Syntax error. That's what I'll call it. It's a syntax error of a paragraph. The question of government serving individuals is further muddied when it takes from some to give to others. Under such an environment, democracy can be corrupted through buying off 51% with benefits taken from 49%, while an ultra-minority operates the government for their personal benefit. It is not enough for the government to serve some. It must serve... Excuse me. It is not enough for the government to serve some. It must serve all. The test to determine whether a government is serving all members cannot be based upon specific outcomes, but based upon the means by which those outcomes are achieved. More specifically, a government that allows secession without war is a government that has the people's willing consent and serves all the people. Anyone who wasn't served would secede. Government is the wrong word. This is me talking. Government is the wrong word for what he's describing in this book. Like, I am more convinced of it than ever. A government that allows individual secession at will is like no government that's ever existed. It violates the practical, existent definition of any government ever. Governments cannot allow people to just secede willy-nilly. They wouldn't function. They have to be coercive to be a government. And if it's not coercive, as he's describing, then it is not government. And this is my definition of government. Sure, maybe he's thinking governance. Maybe he's thinking that it's not a logical contradiction to say you can have a consensual government. Okay, so maybe we disagree and I just need to let this topic go. But it is really going to stick in my craw for the rest of this book. If there is any way to auto-generate transcript for your no treason would be cool. Hope things are going well. I mean, the transcript would be the book itself, which is available for free everywhere. So that would be better. I mean, that's a transcript, right? Or do you mean commentary? I don't know. Anyway, sorry. Back to the book. The question becomes, how should we judge a system if not by its ends? Isn't the whole point of did I skip something? Yeah, no, I didn't. Isn't the whole point of establishing a new process to achieve a better world as defined by some end? Consider a wise, benevolent dictatorship. That's a contradiction in terms. A benevolent dictatorship run by a philosopher king. Such a system may serve the needs of the people today, but eventually the philosopher king will die, and an incomprehensibly evil dictator will take his place. While grasping for the power of a benevolent dictator may seem expedient to those arrogant enough to believe they know how to run things, it fails to be a sustainable system and should therefore be rejected. Judging a democratic process based upon the people it might empower today is like judging a benevolent dictatorship based upon the person who would become king today. All democratic processes will end up producing suboptimal outcomes because they, in effect, are appointing temporary dictators who are part good, part bad, part intelligent, and part ignorant. However, in politics, as in computer science, algorithm design must consider the best case, average case, and worst case performance. In the fullness of time, it is safe to assume that eventually the worst case performance will be realized. It took only a couple of centuries to completely erode the intentions of the philosopher kings who drafted the Constitution. Much of the inevitable erosion was already evident to George Washington by the time he left office. Since the legitimate power of democracy is derived from the consent of the people to the process of democracy, the minority necessarily retains the right to secede and become independent. It is the right of independence that prevents the majority from devouring a minority. The ultimate minority is the individual. Yes. Yes. It's statements like that that restore my hope for this book. It is the right of independence that prevents the majority from devouring a minority. The ultimate minority is the individual. It has been said that democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what to eat for dinner. The lamb might consent to the process if and only if lamb chops are not on the menu. The day the wolves vote to eat lamb chops, the lamb has the right to secede and is not bound by democratic virtue to offer its neck. The animals return to the law of the jungle. The lamb may still be eaten, but democratic legitimacy has nothing to do with it. This is not to say that the sheep wouldn't consent to give up some wool or milk in exchange for the wolves' contribution to security. The key is that there is a voluntary trade and voluntary agreement to a system of compromise. I don't see how the way he's talking now about things needing to be voluntary trade, voluntary consent, the right of the individual to secede from any consensus system that he no longer likes. I see that as conflicting with his earlier statement where he went from being an anarcho-capitalist to supporting government. Like, this is not making holistic sense, let's just say. The principle of democracy is that the people should be in control, and we have already demonstrated that the ability to vote for someone is not the same thing as giving control to the people. If the only people on the ballot are war hawks, then what control do peaceful people have? If the only candidates people get to learn about are those who the media support, then how are the people in control? Perception of public opinion matters. Whether we like it or not, the mob ultimately runs society. Individual property rights mean nothing in a riot. If public opinion, consensus, turns against something, nothing can resist it for long, not even the most oppressive governments. A libertarian, socialist, anarchist, or Marxist utopia is the result of changing public opinion and maintaining public support. Again, he's calling libertarian/anarchistic societies as utopias, which they would not be, and don't know of many people that would claim them to be utopias. I don't even think the Marxists or socialists claim a utopia. I don't know. I don't know. Moving on. If you don't change opinions or alternatively commit genocide, then the utopia cannot last. Well, if a society maintained through threat of genocide would not be an anarchistic society. All right, anyway, moving on. Any society which cannot tolerate differences of opinion is fragile and unsustainable. Unfortunately, most people do not form their opinion based upon judgment, independent judgment, but instead rely upon the opinions of others. The first 22 years of my life, I had a whole host of opinions that I did not arrive at myself. These opinions were absorbed from my family and friends. In turn, my family and friends didn't actually derive at their opinions. That might be a typo. In turn, my family and friends didn't actually arrive at their opinions from independent thought. We were the blind leading the blind. Each and every day, people make decisions based upon what they think other people think. Style, language, morals, religion, politics, and just about everything you can think of are heavily influenced by what we think other people's opinions are. What we think other people think is vastly different than what they really think. What we tell other people is often what we think they want to hear instead of what we really think. When in doubt, most people defer to what they believe is public opinion over their own opinion, and most people are often in doubt. This deferral to public opinion is also why most people yield to democratic processes. This is a resoundingly true paragraph, as evidenced by everything we've experienced with COVID over the last year. And illuminates brightly the danger of social media and news media, corporate media's control over what people are paying attention to. They are exerting almost direct control over what people think the public opinion is, and then this innate drive to conform to public opinion just follows that belief that they've installed artificially. How do we actually know what other people think? Do we really have the ability to ask everyone? Would other people willingly share their opinion with us without first knowing what we think? What happens if someone is able to manipulate how we perceive what other people think? Social media, like I just said. What if what we think other people think is not what they really think? Some of the more sophisticated techniques of manipulating opinion corrupt the measuring and reporting process. If you can control the major media outlets, I just mentioned this, and continuously show support of a minority opinion over the real majority opinion, then people will come to believe that the minority opinion is the majority opinion. Perhaps one of the most overt attempts to manipulate public opinion is the corruption of scientific polling prior to elections. The media tells us who is, quote, electable and who is not. A result of publishing these, quote, scientific polls, people conclude that some candidates are unelectable and that others are extremely popular, even if they're not. Few people like to be in a minority that stands out against the majority. They will often publicly support what they believe to be the majority opinion, even if they privately object. People want to, quote, look good in the eyes of the, quote, popular people. People are afraid of being mobbed, shunned, or embarrassed because of their real opinion. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle that results in the quiet suffering and repression of the majority. The end result is like a married couple that has been silently suffering through a meatloaf dinner every Sunday under a belief planted by an ex that it was their partner's favorite meal. Neither partner is willing to admit that they hate meatloaf because they love their partner, but nevertheless they have it every Sunday. If we don't have an accurate sense of what other people really think, then we can easily suffer when it isn't necessary. Solomon Asch performed a classic conformity experiment in 1951. In this experiment, he put a participant in a room with a number of stooges and asked everyone in the room to perform a, quote, vision test, comparing the length of lines. The stooges would go first and agree on an obviously wrong answer, and then the participant would be asked to answer. Over a number of trials, 75% of the participants conformed to the group opinion over personal perception at least once. On average, about 1/3 of the participants conformed with the clearly incorrect majority. Meanwhile, when asked independently, without a group, the individuals were only wrong about 1% of the time. Imagine the power a social media... just talked about this. Yes. Imagine the power a social media algorithm has to influence your opinion by strategically putting you in virtual rooms with stooges. Imagine further that the stooges don't even have to be in on the game. They could simply be intentionally selected from a minority to create the perception of majority opinion. Yes. This paragraph, so much yes. If you guys are on Facebook and you consume the Facebook feed, you are being manipulated exactly like I just read to you. If you care about the sanctity of your own rational mind, you should delete that shit today, right now. Never log in again. Same for Twitter and everything else. Sorry, side rant. Moving on. People's actions are shaped by what they believe public opinion is. One way to demoralize the silent majority is to make them believe they are in a minority. By controlling the perception of public opinion, the elite can simultaneously change the measured public opinion and isolate those who think for themselves. If we are to achieve a majoritarian, quote, utopia, it becomes critical that people collaborate to produce an accurate and more trustworthy measurement of the aggregate opinion. Facilitating truthful perception of public opinion is the first step toward a peaceful revolution. One approach is to implement private, incorruptible, continuous polling of the population. If only people knew what other people really thought, instead of the masks they must put on in public, then maybe we could realize we have more in common with others than we thought. This would not only be a lot of extra work, but could still produce the answers provided by stooges instead of independent judgments if people form their opinions based upon the media. One way or another, any truly democratic system must be designed to extract honest, independent answers from the people. This is not so easy when most people are rationally ignorant on most things, and therefore have opinions that they falsely believe are their own. In reality, their opinions are just the aggregation of what they falsely believe everyone around them believes. It is like a group of people where, quote, everyone is following everyone. They walk several city blocks only to discover no one was leading them, and no one knew where they were going. If precautions are not taken, man, we're seeing this with COVID hardcore. If precautions are not taken, those skills in propaganda can manipulate a democratic society to serve their personal agenda. How can people consent if they are being intentionally misled? How can intelligent parties agree to a democratic process knowing that the mob isn't actually making decisions on its own, but that it is being guided by a Pied Piper? There are ways to structure the democratic process to minimize the influence of Pied Pipers. Democracy and the rule of law. Anarchists will tell you that they aren't against rules, they are against rulers. Ask them what rules they would like and you will get vastly different answers. Even if they agree on the rules, ask them to agree if and how they have been violated, and you will once again get vastly different answers. What we can conclude from this is that even if you believe in the rule of law, you must first reach consensus on what the rules are, and then continue to reach consensus on when the rules have been violated. Law, being inanimate, is unable to enforce itself or judge disputes. In some sense, the entirety of the law should be the process by which rules are made and disputes resolved. Rule of law then becomes a matter of enforcing that process. To be successful, the violation of the democratic process needs to be as objectively black and white as possible, so that the masses can easily reach consensus on whether or not an individual is guilty of violating democratic process and should be removed from power, or innocent and therefore should retain their power. Objective laws are what make blockchains and cryptocurrencies the closest things to rule of law there is. In the blockchain space, it is known as, quote, code is law, and anything goes if the code allows it. Violation of blockchain law is so objective that a computer can make an automated binary decision. Unfortunately, a computer can be a cruel master when the letter of the law is unintentionally in disagreement with the spirit of the law. In democracies of all types, quote, failure to host an election is a black and white sign that the government has violated the rule of law and is therefore illegitimate. The solution to this failure is to return to the rule of law by holding an election. If the people can agree on this very simple principle, then civil war can be avoided and power can be passed from term to term peacefully. The challenge is the gray area of, quote, dishonest elections. A lot of governments host elections and create enough ambiguity around the process to prevent the people from reaching consensus that the election was illegitimate. Oh, I missed some comments here. A constitutional democracy is when the judges determine that while lamb chops aren't on the menu, mutton is still allowed. Only statists think that anarchism is utopic. Yeah, utopic. Yeah, it's a worrisome classification, especially for somebody that claims to at one time have been of that label. Moving on. A lot of governments host elections and create enough ambiguity around the process to prevent the people from reaching consensus that the election was illegitimate. In a two-party system, people are presented with a false choice, such that even if the vote counting was honest, the candidate selection was effectively rigged. Tell me about it. This last spectacle was hilariously garbage. Oh, I think I can get banned from YouTube for that. So make sure you're watching this on Odysee. There's a link to the same stream on Odysee in the description. The point of this book is to demonstrate that an election is not good enough, that a dino, democracy in name only, is just a covert minority rule. A true democracy must reliably represent the consensus of the majority of people by implementing a process that is robust against factionalism and the corruption of its own process. No constitution is able to secure rights if the people in power choose to ignore them. No separation of powers between executive, judicial, and legislative branches can survive the corruption and collusion of the people involved. How can powers be separate when the people across all branches are all part of one party? The rule of law must live in the heart of the people. It must be simple to describe. It should be trivial to identify when the democratic process has been violated. Most importantly, the solution to a violation of the law should be a return to the law, which the masses can trivially verify by hosting a new election and selection of new leaders. Remember, for the purpose of this section, the entirety of the law is the democratic process and not the, quote, rules passed by those put in power. In theory, a truly democratic process would be able to correct any, quote, man-made rule. The people should be able to easily identify when new rules are against the democratic law. Direct democracy. The concept of direct democracy is that the people should not have to rely upon representatives. All laws should be voted on directly by the people. At first glance, direct democracy appears to prevent corruption of representatives. However, there are a couple challenges that must be addressed. Who gets to draft the laws that the people vote on? Who gets to explain the meaning of the laws to the voters? Most people are rationally ignorant because the value of investing time to understand all of the proposed laws is incredibly small relative to their ability to influence the outcome. Even our elected congressmen don't always read our laws before voting on them. Ever read our laws, probably a more accurate statement. Such a system will be dominated by special interests looking to realize a benefit that justifies the time and money they spend promoting laws to people who are in no position to evaluate the consequences. Even worse, The media will control how laws are framed, which laws get people's attention, and then corrupt the very meaning of the laws in the minds of the people. To implement direct democracy efficiently would require a technological foundation, as votes would be required more often. A giant red flag is that the required technological foundation would immediately fail when the next geomagnetic storm, solar flare, or EMP disrupts our electrical and computer systems. Building a society on top of a fragile technological base sets it up for failure in a worst-case disruption. Not only is technology fragile, but it also inherently separates the people from the process. It makes people dependent upon black box technological processes. It prevents the people from being able to detect corruption, as everyone must rely upon technological experts. Technology prevents things from being operated at a small scale. If the Amish cannot implement the process, then it probably isn't truly democratic. This paragraph was unexpected from a person that has spent his entire sort of professional life attempting to perfect technological processes. So that was an interesting thought process in that paragraph. Furthermore, it can be difficult to determine when the process of direct democracy has been corrupted. Even if we implement a provably honest direct democracy for the purpose of passing laws, it isn't possible to use direct democracy to operate the judicial, or executive branches of government. These two branches of government depend upon having people interpret the laws to enforce them and judge disputes. All of that said, direct democracy does not build consensus. Instead, it divides us. If 51% of the population can pass a law at the expense of 49%, then it will happen. Requiring 70% approval would mean almost nothing will ever pass, creating tyranny of the status quo. Even if we accept that low rate of change is desirable, how exactly would 70% agree to the initial laws? The lack of a scalable consensus-building process is the final nail in the coffin of direct democracy. True democracy. This is the new thing. This is different. Got to set this apart in my mind. If the purpose of democracy is to be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, then it must have the following properties. Again, I disagree with the use of the word government, and really democracy as well, but at least we're putting a qualifier in front of the word democracy to sort of set it apart. We're talking about a true democracy. Number one. Okay, so true democracy must have the following properties. Number one, composed of independent people. 2, independence defined as ability for minority to secede. 3, resistant to covert control by minorities, the 0.01%. 4, survive a systematically misinformed population. 5, aggregate wisdom from local knowledge. 6, not require individuals to possess global knowledge. 7, empower the individual rather than disempower. 8, protect the majority from a minority. 9, protect the minority from the majority. 10, failure transparent to all. 11, process to recover from failure obvious to all. 12, empower people to reach a new consensus. 13, not overly biased toward the status quo. A true democracy establishes a process for many-to-many dispute resolution and compromise that is resistant to capture of a covert minority. It is a system that people voluntarily participate in to escape the law of the jungle. This is not democracy he's talking about. This is a moral philosophy. But, okay. I'm going to try to resist harping on the words used repeatedly, but I am who I am. So it's going to be. All right. It is a system that people voluntarily participate in to escape the law of the jungle. It should protect the minority from the majority and the majority from the minority. A true democracy is a process by which rights are discovered and enforced with the true consent of the people. Experience tells us that dino systems fail to deliver the promise of true democracy. We need a new approach. Okay, well, we will pick the book up there next time. I hope you guys are enjoying. I am definitely enjoying myself. All right, guys. Let me know in the comments if you're enjoying this book. And I will catch you next time. Have a great evening. Wow, what time is it? Woo! Midnight 30. All right, guys. Take it. I almost said peace, love, and anarchy. That's not this show. Good night.